Good evening. I'm Stephen Jakes. I'm with the Dole Institute. I'd like to welcome you here this evening. We've got a few brief announcements to make before we have our program. First of all, if you look on the back of your programs, we've got some incredibly great programs coming up still yet this semester in the next month. And I will note that tomorrow in the afternoon at 2 p.m. we are continuing our tribute to veterans regarding Veterans Day and our salute to veterans right here at the Institute. We have on November 14th, next Tuesday, the former head of the United States Agency for International Development, Brian Atwood, is going to speak on America's responsibilities to developing nations in crisis. I will point out that he'll be talking about some things that are of critical importance to a lot of people here in Lawrence, including Darfur and Rwanda and the entire African continent. On Thursday the 16th, Wednesday the 29th, and Wednesday, December 6th. 3 programs that are extremely timely, talking about the future of American politics now and after the midterms. On the 16th, we have Daryl Hart, who is an author and church historian and a noted religious conservative and chronicler of the religious right. And a very interesting program, A Last Dance, Why the Romance Between the Religious Right and American Conservatism May Be Over, which is obviously extremely timely at the moment. And something we just found out about today, we just committed today, Ryan Sager has written a new book called The Elephant in the Room, Evangelicals, Libertarians, and the Battle Control of the Republican Party. And on Wednesday, the 6th of December, Mark Halpern, the political director for ABC News, who's written a new book on the way to win, taking the White House in 2008. These are going to be great programs, and as I said, extremely timely and just really last minute that we put these together in the post-election time frame. We will have Q&A immediately after our speaker's remarks. Wait for a cordless microphone to come to you so everybody in the room can hear you. And Bill Lacey is so much better at discussing this than I am at talking about this in a lighthearted way. But we encourage you to ask your question, not to filibuster. We have about a 10-second attention span here, and longer if it's a compliment. And immediately after the program, we're going to have a book signing. Ed Humes is going to sign copies of his books, and the book sales in front, I will remind you, they make wonderful Christmas gifts, especially for your friends who were lucky enough to take advantage of the GI Bill. So right now I'd like to introduce our director, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. A major part of our mission, designed by Bob Dole and Chancellor Bob Hemingway here at the Dole Institute, is to honor those men and women who defend America. Tonight's program is the first of a two-part Veterans Day program that concludes with our tribute to veterans tomorrow at 2 p.m. I hope all of you can make it. Before we go any further, I wanted all the veterans to raise your hand, please. Let's thank the veterans for their service. As the subtitle of our guest book says, the GI Bill transformed America. Its legacy endures even today. I noted recently when our provost, Richard LaRiviere, who is here, Richard and Jan, raise your hands so everybody can say hello to you. Our provost spoke on the world economy recently, and he talked about the GI Bill and the importance of putting in the context of the importance of what higher education can accomplish. What he said was the very reason we've been able to move up the value chain for the last 50 years as dramatically and as effectively as we have been able to is because in 1944, the United States said, when all these boys come back from overseas, we're going to provide them with a free education. It transformed this economy. That's what Ed Humes is here to talk about tonight. Last May, I received an email from Ed. He asked me how he might get in touch with Senator Bob Dole about this book project that he was working on. Well, I got the information to him, but then, as we do often here at the Dole Institute, when presented with an opportunity, you try to seize it. So I said to him, hey, you really ought to come to the Dole Institute and talk about your new book when it's published. And lo and behold, he's here tonight. He immediately agreed to do that. Ed is the third Pulitzer Prize winner to appear at the Institute this semester. He won the award for his specialized military reporting back in, I believe, 1989. The stories that year included an investigation of decades of fatal helicopter crashes linked to faulty night vision devices, also dispatches from Panama during the final days of General Noriega, an examination of the Navy's secret research program on dolphins and whales, and the story of the unjust execution of an Army private during World War II and his nephew's efforts 50 years later to clear his name. He's written a number of other books as well, and as well also as magazine and newspaper articles. He has a very good website, by the way, and I spent some time on it this afternoon and found this, what I think is really a fascinating brief comment on how he defines his craft. He defines it as follows. In my books, I try to take readers inside worlds most don't get to visit or see close up on their own. We're looking forward to hearing some of that tonight. Please welcome Ed Humes.
Well, I'm happy to be in this part of the world for the first time, to Kansas, and to take part in the Veterans Day program here. This book over here was a departure for me. All of my other work previously had been more current affairs, and this was my first more historical book, and it was a chance to talk to some amazing men and women, members of our greatest generation, and to use their stories to tell a larger story about the GI Bill. Let me tell you a little bit about the GI Bill. Imagine telling an entire generation they could receive a free college education in any school that would accept them. KU, Harvard, the Sorbonne, anywhere, courtesy of Uncle Sam. Throw in a monthly stipend while they're in school for living expenses, plus money for books too. And when they graduate, there'll be a government-backed home loan waiting for them if they wish it. No money down, no credit checks, buy a house cheaper than renting an apartment. Instant equity for all. Then throw in a smorgasbord of subsidized business loans, farm loans, free job training, medical care, job placement, and up to a year's worth of weekly paychecks until you find work. What insane congressman, senator, or president would ever propose such a costly boondoggle? Such government largesse to millions of young people, such outright social engineering. It could never pass political muster today, for it would be the most enormous, far-reaching, life-changing government program in the history of the world. And so it was. We know it today as the original GI Bill. Because today's unthinkable was yesterday's matter of course. FDR and Congress adopted what was the humbly named Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 with bipartisan fervor during the height of the most horrendous war in the history of mankind. Somehow, in the midst of World War, they crafted an act of unrivaled generosity. The stated goal was simple: to help 16 million veterans and their families resume their old lives after the scourge of war. But this investment in America's future ended up powering far more than a simple return to the status quo. Instead, it transformed the American dream, the very fabric of the nation. It raised up suburbia out of bean fields and dirt roads. It turned a country of renters into a nation of homeowners. It boosted what was an insignificant middle class before the war, about 1 in 10 Americans, to the most important demographic in the country within 10 years after the war, 1 in 3 Americans. And it fueled a steady rise in the standard of living that outlasted 3 decades. Finally, it trained the men and women who built much of what is good in America today. The scientific prowess that helped win the Cold War, that ushered in the information age, that saved thousands of children from disease and birth defects, that took us to the moon. The GI Bill, here's some amazing statistics. The GI Bill provided the education for 14 Nobel Prize winners, 3 Supreme Court justices, 3 presidents, 12 senators, 24 Pulitzer Prize winners, 238,000 teachers, 91,000 scientists, 67,000 doctors, 450,000 engineers, let's not forget the 240,000 accountants, along with 1 million lawyers, nurses, businessmen, artists, actors, writers, pilots, and others. Such notables as William Rehnquist, Daniel Inouye, George McGovern, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a fellow from Russell, Kansas by the name of Bob Dole, Deke Slayton, Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, Aaron Spelling, Joseph Heller, Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, Art Buchwald, Mario Puzo, Rod Serling, Gene Hackman. The list goes on and on. The original GI Bill was truly an engine of opportunity. There was really never anything else like it. There's nothing like it on the horizon. And that's a problem. For it's not just veterans who are being shortchanged by today's less generous GI Bill benefits, by the cutbacks to programs intended to support our troops returning from war, though they certainly are being shortchanged. The story's bigger than that. It's about the fact that America has no similar engine of opportunity today, no similar investment in the future as the original GI Bill. And that's something we as a nation ought to consider, to debate. Because I'm not talking about investing in the next fiscal quarter, which is all we seem to care about these days, the next quarter, the next election. I'm talking about investing in the next quarter century, which is what animated the GI Bill. Which is why I believe the history of that GI Bill was worthy of a book, why it's so instructive and important, and I hope inspiring to people, as it was inspiring to me. You know, it's become conventional wisdom that America's great post-war achievements arose from individual American ingenuity, from the miracle of free markets, from the personal greatness of the generation that won World War II, and all of that was certainly part of it. But the truth of it is, none of it was a given. The creation of the middle class, of widespread home ownership, of college as a virtual entitlement, and white-collar jobs as a mass aspiration was not simply the work of unfettered free markets. Quite the opposite. It took the biggest of big government programs to make those things happen, and those changes took place over heavy opposition. The colleges fought tooth and nail against throwing open their gates. The president of the University of Chicago predicted his campus would be turned into a hobo jungle if they accepted those veterans on campus. Adamantly opposed was the president of Harvard and some of the other major schools. They'd be eating crow later on, but at the time, they were horrified. The banking industry, much opposed to the low-interest mortgages and opening up ownership to the masses, to the blue-collar members of society. They weren't supposed to own homes. They were supposed to rent. If history had been the guide, the veterans of World War II might have only gotten $60 and a train ticket home. That's what World War I veterans got. They might have gotten a pension system mired in graft and corruption. That was the Civil War legacy. Or they might have gotten nothing at all because, incredibly enough, the Continental Congress stiffed most of the Revolutionary War veterans and never paid them the pensions they were promised when they enlisted. That shameful record of veteran mistreatment was broken in 1944. The greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw has so correctly called them, after a youth spent enduring the Great Depression, followed by the sacrifices of war, became America's most privileged generation, gifted with more government largesse than any group in history, before or since, and we all benefited as a result. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just ask a couple of former senators and presidential nominees, Robert Dole and George McGovern, ideological opposites but friends, men who were able to work together to do great things for America, and both of whom are profiled in my book. And both of them speak in exactly the same terms about the greatness of the GI Bill. It helped put, as they tell it, the great in the greatest generation. It gave them educations and careers and opportunities that otherwise never would have been afforded to the vast majority of veterans. This is how McGovern put it during a joint appearance with with Mr. Dole after the dedication of the World War II Memorial in Washington a couple years back. He said, "If in fact we were anything close to the greatest generation, it's probably the result of three factors. We were honed and toughened by the Great Depression for 10 years prior to World War II. Nobody had a dollar. There weren't any rich people. We were all poor in the 1930s. And then the war itself. We believed in it. We had a clear mission, and we executed it. So that gave us a sense of self-confidence. And the third thing is the GI Bill of Rights. That's one of the most marvelous things the federal government has ever done, is to offer these 16 million people who fought in World War II a chance to go to college of their choice, any college of their choice. I went all the way through Northwestern University to a PhD in American history. It changed my life." Senator Dole wholeheartedly agreed in his usual pithy manner. "It was a pretty good little law," he said. "Maybe we need something like it again." High praise indeed from Bob Dole. What other sorts of Americans benefited from the GI Bill? Consider Arthur Penn, another veteran of World War II I write about in over here. He was supposed to come home from the Ardennes and the occupation of Europe to take over his father's watchmaker's shop on Sansom Street in Philadelphia, a prospect he dreaded. Instead, he used the GI Bill to attend Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which at that time was a hotbed of artistic innovation in the post-war decade that, like many schools in that era, avoided closure and actually thrived thanks to the GI Bill and the financial support it provided. Black Mountain introduced Penn to a whole new world of drama and poetry and acting. Indeed, the GI Bill sparked a renaissance in American arts and letters in that era. Penn went on to create, or help create, a little post-war entertainment industry called network television. He became a television director during what we now know as the golden age of television, working with the top stars of the day. He also ended up in the control booth for the very first televised presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon. He was working for the Kennedy camp, and a lot of people believe that he helped engineer JFK's victory in that debate by suggesting that all camera angles be very tight and close up on the candidates, and he directed those accordingly. People who watched that debate on television overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won. People who listened on the radio thought Nixon did better. The power of image in a political campaign was born at that moment in 1960. Arthur Penn went on to direct some enduring classics in American stage and film, including The Miracle Worker and Bonnie and Clyde. His stories is one of my favorites in over here. Let me tell you about a couple of farm boys I got a chance to meet. A guy named Bob Booth and another one named Dick Cock. Booth used his GI Bill financed engineering degree to land a job on the design team for the B-52 strategic bomber, still in service after half a century, and to figure out how to keep the first submarine-launched nuclear missile, the Polaris, from exploding every time it blasted off. Accomplishments that quite literally turned the tide in the Cold War and helped ensure American military supremacy for decades. Dick Cock, meanwhile, having been shot down and placed in a prison camp in Germany during the war, where he obsessively read the one book he could get a hold of, a biography of the Mayo brothers, got it into his head that he'd like to do something like those guys had done. He used his veteran benefits to earn a medical degree. Today he's a pediatrician in Los Angeles at the very famous Los Angeles Children's Hospital, one of the great centers for child medical care in the world. Still practicing in his 80s, rides his bike to work. Earlier in his career, he pioneered treatments and testing, he's known the world over for this, that have prevented tens of thousands of cases of developmental disability in newborns. There's just a couple of guys who got their GI Bill educations whose accomplishments have touched tens of thousands of people. Those kinds of stories are legion. That's why it was such a privilege to write this book. And to use those stories to tell, those personal accounts, to tell the larger story, the larger after-the-war story of the greater generation, the greatest generation. because the benefits that flowed from the GI Bill that they used had a ripple effect so huge on our country as to be almost incalculable. It lifted not only them up, but it lifted up their families and their children and their grandchildren, because of course the next generation, well, they had to go to college too. They had to own a home. That's the American way. The next generation always does better. I think that begs a question, though, that I hope that people who read over here might consider, because I'd like to know what has happened to the government that could create something so magnificent, and why we as a people have stopped expecting that sort of greatness from our joint enterprise, our government, our commonwealth, as we native Pennsylvanians call it. I like that term, commonwealth, because it really describes what government ought to be. What happened to the government Franklin Roosevelt left after the end of World War II? One that eased the Depression, created the bulwark of Social Security, cleaned up within a year the devastating hurricane of 1938 that had destroyed much of Long Island, united the country after Pearl Harbor, created publicly owned defense plants and utilities that were both efficient and cost-effective, if you can believe that, won the most terrible war ever fought on the planet, and then bequeathed the next generation the epochal opportunities of the GI Bill. It's ironic indeed, and I was talking to Bill about this earlier, that a very prominent member of that greatest generation that enjoyed the GI Bill's largesse, former President Ronald Reagan, led the country a quarter century ago to a very different set of expectations about government. He convinced many of us to look at it this way. To quote him, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" An entire generation that I think should have known better adopted this laugh line as a truism and passed it on. And those 9 words have become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we now have a government that, at every level, not just in Washington, but right down to the local level, that many of us seem to expect to fail. And all too often it seems to fulfill those expectations. Whether you're looking at New Orleans or Iraq or the little library in my small town in California that now is closed more often than it's open. I'd like to offer 2 contrasting images that I think tell us a lot about where we were then and where we are now. After World War II, millions of veterans lined up for hours for a remarkable purpose: to register for those free college educations, to buy homes cheaper than renting, to sign up for vocational and training and job counseling, to get those farm and business loans that the GI Bill authorized, and to do great things with them. In the wake of the Iraq War and occupation, very different but no less remarkable lines now snake across many military bases nationwide. Bread lines. This is one of the dirtiest secrets, in my opinion, of the war in Iraq, that thousands of military families have been left so desperate they must queue up for donations of surplus cheese, day-old bread, and damaged boxes of frozen food. These are the families of men and women who right now, at this moment, are putting their lives on the line for their country. And it's especially true in areas of the country with high costs of living, especially true at bases like the Marines Camp Pendleton in Southern California near my home, where these food lines are a weekly fixture. I don't think it matters how you feel about the war in Iraq, whether you think it was the right decision at the right time or the worst decision at the worst time. I think everyone in this room would agree that the families of our brave servicemen and women ought not to be reduced to charity cases. On top of everything that the men and women fighting overseas have to worry about, they shouldn't have to worry that their children might be going hungry. When our warriors come home from Iraq, all too many find empty bank accounts, maxed out credit cards, and the realization that the college benefits used to entice enlistees often won't cover the costs of a 4-year degree, as they once did, nor support their families while they're in class. The reservists and guardsmen, pulling the same dangerous war duty as regular troops, get even less, only 27% of the GI Bill education benefits, and sometimes they get nothing at all thanks to some unfortunate fine print in the current GI Bill. Still others wounded in a war that is, and I just read this in the paper the other day, costing the country $10 million an hour, learn that programs to heal their injuries, their post-combat stress, and their financial distress have been systematically cut. Very different GI Bill today than it was in 1944. But as I said earlier, and this is the case I try to make in my book, is that there's really something larger at stake than how we treat our veterans, as important as that is. The larger question goes back to what Bob Dole wondered back at the World II Memorial dedication. Maybe we need something like it again. He wasn't talking about a program for veterans alone. He was talking about a new engine of opportunity for the whole nation, one that uses the GI Bill as a model for investing in the future. Now, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about that? Well, how much is it going to cost? Was the GI Bill that was offered to the 1 in 8 Americans who served in World War II, most of an entire generation, costly? Yeah, absolutely. But like any wise investment, it more than paid for itself. Congress studied this in 1988 and determined that every dollar spent on education under the bill, the original World War II GI Bill, returned $7 through increased productivity, consumer spending, and tax revenue. So in today's dollars, it costs $50 billion to send those 2 million plus veterans to four-year colleges and 5 million veterans to vocational school. $50 billion. It returned $350 billion over time to the economy. And unlike some other less fortunate expenses by the government over the years, the GI Bill's expenses left us stronger, safer, more united, and more prosperous. I call that investing in the future. And though it was a classic big government social welfare program, it is beloved by conservatives and progressives alike for a simple reason. As Bill Clinton put it, it represented a hand up, not a hand out. It empowered a generation, but it left the choices up to the individual, what to study, where to live, what career to pursue. It was uniquely American in its approach. It had sweeping power because it touched a whole generation. Today's GI Bill, even if it had equivalent benefits, which it does not, would reach less than 1% of Americans. Decency and patriotism demand that it be strengthened, and today's veterans deserve as much as we can give them. But short of World War and a massive draft, the GI Bill will never again be the same engine of opportunity it was in the 1950s. Before he died, FDR suggested a solution. He proposed a program of national service. Young people would be enlisted to do good works while earning education, medical, housing, pension benefits, whatever was deemed to be most needed for the times. Not just veterans, but everyone, a kind of a civilian GI Bill. And polls at the time showed a receptive public, but the idea died with Roosevelt. During the Clinton years, there was a modest resurrection of the idea with the AmeriCorps project, but it was very small. And if you're going to do it, much more would be needed. I don't know if that's the solution for what America needs, but it seems like it's something that, once again, might be worthy of discussion. It's interesting to be here on Veterans Day for this, and also at a time after the elections this week, in which it seemed that Americans are expressing unhappiness with where the country's been going. I guess there's a lot of messages we could draw from that. I'd like to think that there's a message that goes beyond party or partisanship and goes back to those 9 words of Ronald Reagan, and maybe the idea that we're ready to say maybe those words weren't so wise after all. I mean, if you look around, you can see evidence that we don't really believe that government's the problem all the time, whether it's at the free public library on Main Street or this public university where we sit, where a world-class education can be had affordably because the state of Kansas wants it to be so. You can see it in a government that in years past ended racial segregation, eradicated the scourge of polio and smallpox, harnessed the atom, put a man on the moon, rebuilt war-ravaged Europe and Japan with the Marshall Plan and one of the greatest acts of international generosity ever undertaken, and raised America to new heights with the equally generous GI Bill. That's a heck of a legacy for a government that's the most dangerous 9 words we can think of. I don't really believe that that's a legacy we want to turn away from. You know, that's the kind of legacy that made it possible for a young man from a poor family to come home from the Navy and service in the Pacific during World War II, and to do something he never, in his wildest dreams, imagined he could do. Buy a house, a little slice of paradise, at least as he saw it, a brick row house in a blue-collar neighborhood in Philadelphia, built in the post-war GI-fed housing boom, GI Bill-fed housing boom. 3 bedrooms and a pink-tiled bathroom and a postage stamp of a yard, but it was his, and to him it was paradise. That's how a poor kid from an immigrant family, a truck driver who never graduated high school, could raise a family in a good, solid neighborhood with good, solid schools, then send his children to college, a feat he also never dared imagine before the war, and in which he took immense pride until the end of his life. That man was my father, Edward Aloysius Humes, and he too thought the GI Bill was the greatest, and nobody would have dared try to tell him otherwise. And he liked Ronald Reagan. He voted for him, but he never bought those 9 words, not for a minute. Now we're in an era when college is a growing financial burden for many families. Home ownership is growing less affordable each day. The middle class is getting squeezed. We are losing our competitive edge to other nations in advanced degrees and skills, even as our future security and prosperity depends on those skills, on developing new energy sources, on dealing with environmental problems, with new minds and new ideas. When the American dream, so generously nurtured after World War II, is now under siege, maybe it's time again to expect some greatness from our government, our common enterprise, our common wealth. You know, for the first time in our history, there's polls that show Americans expect their children to inherit less prosperous lives than their own. I can't believe that that's the legacy this country wants to leave. And we certainly deserve better. Our children certainly deserve better. And the GI Bill's great success in improving the lives of Americans, of finding ways to invest in all our futures, is evidence that we can and have done better. Now, the no filibustering rule is in play, so I'm going to end my remarks and take any questions or comments. And I'm told that you must wait for the microphone before asking your question, or Bill will come get you. Sir?
Ed, in your brilliant talk, which actually inspires me to a new America, you mentioned that the reservists, especially certain classes of reservists, because of unfortunate fine print
Yes.
in the current version of what could be called some kind of GI Bill, could you elaborate on what that fine print is, please, Ed?
Yes. Well, first there's the fact that the education benefits that reservists and guardsmen who have, during the course of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, actually comprised about 50% of the forces over there, somewhat less now, but over the whole length of the operation, about 50%. They get what is now 27% of the overall education benefits. So if a regular Army or Navy or Marine veteran goes to college, they get 4 years up to $36,000, which will cover, including room and board, the average public university in America today. If you're a guardsman or a reservist that did exactly the same duty, you'll get 27% of that. They were equal at one time, but because each required a separate legislative authorization, one has been continually raised, the regular troops, the other has remained static, and so the disparity between the two has increased. The fine print I'm talking about is a requirement that unless a Guard member or reservist serves 24 consecutive or 24 total months active duty, their education benefit disappears as soon as their service ends, whereas the regular troops keep it for 10 years. Most of the Guard and Reserve troops are only doing 18 months. So for lack of that last 6 months, they completely lose their education benefits. It's most unfair. And there have been attempts in 2 previous Congresses to pass legislation to correct that. They have not passed muster, nor have they been supported by the administration. I spoke to Congresswoman Pelosi's office about this because there had been a lot of back and forth between the 2 parties, and according to her spokesperson, that's on her legislative agenda to address. So we'll have to see if that promise is kept or not. But that's the fine print of which I was talking about, and it's very sad because some of the veterans are coming home and are very surprised to find that the benefits are not what they expected them to be.
Sir, what percentage of African American servicemen took advantage of the educational aspect and then the home loan aspect?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad somebody raised that because a whole chapter of my book is spent actually 2 chapters on how the GI Bill did and did not serve women and minorities, particularly African American veterans. The education benefit in terms of actually using the GI Bill to go to school or training of some kind, the percentage of African Americans who used it in that way actually was greater than the percentage of white veterans in sheer numbers. However, in many parts of the country, black veterans were compelled to attend, I'm talking about the southern parts of the country, the historically black universities, of which at that time there was about, I believe, 8. I may be wrong about that number, but they were denied entrance to many other institutions throughout the country. And furthermore, many of the vocational and technical schools that opened up to meet the demand created by the mass discharge of veterans and the funds that the GI Bill made available were taking advantage of veterans and were not really educating. They were just taking their money. And black veterans were particularly cheated in that regard as well. And there was an entire congressional investigation of this in the 1950s. Housing was much more problematic. You do not see the huge percentage in increase in home ownership for non-white veterans that you saw for white veterans, simply because America was still a segregated country, and black veterans were not able to get the home loans or the home purchases that they should have been entitled to under the law. The reason for this, it's a fascinating and horrible story, but the chairman of the committee that was in charge of veterans legislation in the House, George Eliot Rankin, was just an unmitigated racist. He would give these horrible speeches on the floor of the House, doing everything from defending Nazi war criminals to celebrating the Ku Klux Klan as a great American institution. And he made it impossible for the GI Bill to pass unless a provision was inserted in the law to administer the benefits locally. And this was couched as a states' rights issue. But what the real agenda was that instead of having Washington oversee the dispensation of veterans' benefits, officials in each state and sometimes county would take care of that. And that meant in parts of the country where there were Jim Crow laws and where segregation was, where so-called separate and equal was the law of the land, local officials would simply deny benefits that black veterans were legally entitled to. And that suppressed their ability to purchase homes and to increase the percentage of home ownership among blacks, veterans and non-veterans alike. And so you don't see African Americans even to this day with as high a level as home ownership as white Americans, and a large reason for that is the inequities during the housing boom in the 1950s. It seems to be a direct correlation. Yes.
Good evening. I have a question. I would like for you to speak a little bit about Harry Colmary, since we are about 20 miles from where he lived at one time.
You bet.
And also, would you say a little bit about the efforts of some to see that he is awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom?
That I can't speak to, but I certainly can address Harry Colmary's role in the GI Bill. He, of course, was the former president of the American Legion, World War I veteran, and hand-wrote the first draft of the GI Bill on stationery from the Mayflower Hotel, which is now on display in the Smithsonian. The original concept for the GI Bill was suggested by President Roosevelt in one of his fireside chats, and he gave the general outlines of a program that he wanted to assure Americans during the war would be in place so that the unrest and problems that followed World War I, when veterans were not treated so well, and there was actually a march on the Capitol by tens of thousands of angry World War I veterans, would not be repeated after World War II. And the interesting thing was that Roosevelt saw this as part of a larger program that he wanted to see adopted that he called the Second Bill of Rights, that would increase benefits and pensions, health care, and so forth to the American public at large. The American Legion concentrated on creating a legislative proposal modeled after what Roosevelt had suggested, but that strictly focused on veterans. For a number of reasons. One, that was their constituency. They existed to represent the interests of veterans, which desperately needed to be represented based on past history. And two, they understood that there would be a much more political support from across the spectrum for a veterans benefit program as opposed to an enormous economic bill of rights for the country at large. So they actually crafted the proposal that was introduced to Congress in January of 1944 that eventually became the GI Bill. But it was one of many competing proposals. Some wanted just a large cash bonus to veterans, and that was one of the bills introduced. The veterans organization Disabled Veterans of America was very much opposed initially to the American Legion's version. They were worried that it was going to take benefits away from wounded servicemen who really needed the help in overcoming their injuries and their disabilities. So there was, even among veterans groups, there was battling over what vision would best serve the country. Colmary was a very effective advocate for his proposal, and which in its original incarnation included health care that was eventually taken off and handled under separate legislation. But it left unemployment, the 5220 Club, I'm sure some of you here have heard of that, where you could get $20 a week, a princely sum, at for 52 weeks to support yourself while you looked for work. That was thought to be the most enormous part of the program. And it was the most contentious one because there was congressmen who thought, oh, the American Legion just wants to turn our fighting men into louts. They're just going to sit under their trees and do nothing for 52 weeks with those $20. They couldn't have been more wrong, of course. The average veteran used those benefits for, if they used them at all, for 18 weeks. Not, they weren't taking advantage. Colmary was also adamant that the housing, which was really the revolutionary part of the program that Roosevelt hadn't suggested, and the college benefits be widely available to all veterans, as opposed to on a by needs basis, or some proposals said you could only get a college benefit if your education was interrupted by the war. And the Legion and Colmary were very strong and successful proponents of the idea of making it broader in its reach. so that all veterans could take advantage of it. So that's his legacy. He played a very pivotal role. But the support in Congress for passing it quickly became overwhelming and bipartisan. Now, perhaps you can tell me more about the National Medal of Freedom.
I understand that Congressman Jim Ryan and Senator Sam Brownback introduced measures in Congress some time ago for that to happen. And I understand now that it's being reintroduced. I'm curious as to why it apparently did not succeed at the first time. I don't know whether Congress approved and then it was not followed through at the White House, or just what that situation is.
I can't imagine there'd be a whole lot of opposition to it, so
yeah, that's my
it's worth looking
thinking,
into,
too.
though.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments, questions here in front?
Hi, I'm a veteran. I'm getting GI Bill benefits here while I'm going to KU. And when I'm describing the GI Bill to friends, I basically, like, they want to know what it is, and they think that it's like a scholarship or maybe it's a grant. And then I explain to them that, you know, it's really not like that. It's like you pay money to get it, you know. So it's really like one of the best government bonds you could possibly get, you know, because it's guaranteed by the government, but you do have to buy it, you know, with your service and your money.
Actually, there's a payroll deduction now. I forgot to mention that. Did you have to do that?
Yeah, you don't have to. I think you volunteered to do it, unless it's changed. I haven't been.
I think it's $100 a month for 12 months.
Yeah, it's only $1,200, and you get, like, you know, quite a bit of money, so it's pretty good. Do you have any other sort of analogy that you would describe the GI Bill? Like, do you agree with the grant analogy, or is there any type of? How would you sum it up in a nice little?
Well, I think it's a benefit. You earned it through your service in the military, and so it's part of the payment that you're getting for that service and for your role in defending the country. I mean, it's one of the promises that the government made to you when you made the commitment to join the military, and it's a great thing for the country to do. I have a question for you. Do the benefits you receive cover the full cost of your education here? I'm sorry, if you didn't hear that, the answer was that it'll cover about 3 of the 4 years of this gentleman's education here, and that's pretty good. That's better than a lot of veterans are able to do, and it's generous. Don't get me wrong. It's just that in comparison to what was previously offered, you can have a free ride to Harvard on the GI Bill. Of course, Harvard cost a lot less back then. It's just not as transformative an experience for the veterans or for the country. It's still an excellent opportunity. I'm sure you would agree.
Could you hear that?
Go.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that friends that I've talked to that have gotten out of the military are in a similar case to what Ed has described, which is they don't even want to go down the path because it will only pay for a couple of years of their schooling. And another thing that they don't like is how they have to jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops just to make it all happen. And once they're done with the military, they kind of don't want to be in the bureaucratic sort of frame anymore. So
Yes. Over here.
Of course, this was not, for the World War II veterans, this was not a promise. This was something that happened
Absolutely.
afterwards. We had no idea that it would be offered. So it changes everything, I think, the way you look at what's offered now and what was offered as a gift after.
That's an excellent point, since these benefits were, many people were already in the military, had enlisted or were drafted before the GI Bill, so there was no inducement there. And even after it passed, most veterans, sometimes even after they were discharged, didn't really understand what they were entitled to, and it was only later that word began to spread for many. So, an excellent point.
My father was in World War I, and there was a class. They had to go do a class action suit to get what they'd been promised.
World War I, did you say?
Yes, in World War I, they had to file a class action suit to get what they had been promised, and they finally got the money like 10 years later.
Yeah, that's very true. After there was widespread complaints that the veterans of World War I hadn't been well treated, the Congress adopted a program to give them a bonus of several $1,000s, but it would not be payable until 1944, I believe, was the time frame. It would be a bond that would mature, and they could borrow a little bit against it, but they were going to have to wait for their bonus. And when the Depression hit, nobody wanted to wait anymore for that bonus, and Congress was petitioned to authorize the payment of the bonus early. President Hoover promised to veto any such legislation within 10 minutes of it landing on his desk, and the World War II veterans marched on the Capitol and camped out on President Hoover's doorstep for quite some period of time, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 of them in a Hooverville, a tent city, singing songs and marching in formation and generally tormenting President Hoover to the point where he called out the cavalry. And this was the last cavalry charge on American soil that I'm aware of. And the Hooverville was torched, and the veterans were driven at saber point away from Hoover's site. Moment that was captured in the news photography of the day, and President Roosevelt, then Governor Roosevelt, opened up the paper the next day in the governor's mansion in New York and said, "No, I just won the election," and true story. But part of the impetus for the GI Bill, in addition to the altruism behind it, and wanting to do right by veterans, was the fear that, if the government failed to provide for millions of men being demobilized and coming back looking for work and homes and a new life, if we failed to prepare for that moment, it wouldn't just be 20,000 people marching on the Capitol, it might be a couple of million of them. And that was a real fear behind the desire to pass the GI Bill, in addition to the nobler motives.
Having gone through on the full ride of the GI Bill, it hurts me to know that present-day veterans do not get as much.
Thank you for that.
I wondered, the people who can go for 2 years or 3 years on a GI Bill, with government loans as reasonable as they are, why wouldn't they go ahead and borrow the money for the last year?
Well, I think a lot do have to borrow for that. There's also the issue of, many veterans have dependents, have spouses and children, and their ability to go to school, to pay for that school, to take out loans, and to have a living wage for their family is it's often just too much. And consequently, there's a whole population of veterans who are entitled to educational benefits who have not taken advantage of it. But that's not a new problem. That goes all the way back beyond Vietnam. Unfortunate but true. And, the World War II veterans didn't get a lot of money to support their family while they went to school, but they did get some. And with a little part-time job maybe on the side, a lot of them were able to pull it off. It's harder now.
Obviously, paying for a revamping of the current GI Bill or a more sweeping program of policy change would be the biggest issue, as you stated. Is there some sort of precedent for how to pay for it in the first bill? You said it was brought up again during the Clinton years. Was there some sort of idea of how to pay for it or what to do about that when it was brought up again?
Well, the original GI Bill, which was quite costly, but ultimately did pay for itself, was paid for out of the general tax revenues that the federal government received. It was deemed to be a worthy expenditure. I just read in the paper that the expenses so far for the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan is $505 billion. That's $500 billion. And I don't recall any debate about how we were going to pay for that. I do know I could send about 10 million kids to Harvard for that much money, and medical school. We have a very prosperous country that can make choices about where we want to spend our treasure. And if the American people would like to recreate something like the GI Bill and invest in our future in that way, we certainly have the capability of doing it. But it's a choice. If we pay for that, then there's something else we can't pay for.
I want to ask this young man a question. Your fellow veterans that are not taking advantage of it, are they going to school?
Most of them are just.
Maybe that's one of the big differences between the two generations. I suspect even if it had only been for 2 years, there have been a great many of my generation that would have taken advantage of it. But we didn't have maybe the training that they're getting in the Army either.
Any other questions tonight?
I have a lady sitting next to me, and we started graduate school. I had about 1.5 years of GI Bill left. With her pregnant, we ended up 5 years later with her having 3 children and me getting 2 degrees. But we didn't live very high on the hog, I'll tell you. But everyone else there at the University of Illinois was in the same boat, and we got by. And we had 7 of us that graduated at about the same time who maintained a round-robin letter until just a few years ago.
Thank you. That's wonderful. 2 degrees. What are they in? Mathematics.
Any final questions tonight? Okay, let's thank Ed for coming out to the University of Kansas.
Thank you.